Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've got the new version of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This is slightly cheaper and a little bit less powerful, and so in this video I want to talk about whether or not this cheaper model is going to be worth it compared to the standard one that we've already seen for the past few months. And the only major difference between the older Retroid Pocket Flip 2 and this new one is the chipset. It is the Dimensity 1100, the same chip that's in the old Retroid Pocket 4 Pro that came out about a year and a half ago. And so it's a mixture between the two. We've got the same form factor and screen as the original Retroid Pocket Flip 2, but the performance of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. So this video is really going to focus on price and performance and the idea of whether or not saving a few dollars is going to be worth it. And I do like to give the bottom line before we even get started. And I think in this case, it is worth it to get the Snapdragon 865 model, even if it is $30 more. However, if you are on a tight budget and you only really plan on playing up through like PSP and maybe GameCube and Nintendo Wii, then I do think this one is good enough. Either way, we've got a lot to talk about, so grab a snack and drink, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's quickly go over specs and pricing, but a lot of this is going to be the same as the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, which I have covered in other videos. So we're looking at the same 8GB of RAM, 128 gigs of internal storage, and that same beautiful 5.5-inch OLED display with a 1080p resolution. It's also got the same battery size, 5000 mAh, it's the same weight, 306 grams, it's also Wi-Fi 6 and has Android 13, and of course it is a clamshell. The only difference between the two has to do with that CPU. The more expensive chip is the Snapdragon 865. It has the Adreno 650 GPU and is also 8 cores. The one we're looking at today is the Dimensity 1100. This one is also 8 cores, but has a Mali GPU, the G77. It's also a newer chip and has Bluetooth 5.2 compared to the Snapdragon 865 with a Bluetooth 5.1. And so on paper, they are pretty similar processors. They're both 8 cores and have similar clock speeds. Now, both of these models come in 4 different colors, and the Snapdragon 865 version is $230 before shipping. And these were both announced at the same time, but the Dimensity 1100 one has not been available until right now. And the one we're looking at today is $30 cheaper, so it's $200 before shipping and all that. However, because it was just launched the other day, they do have some introductory coupons. They've got a code for an additional $20 off, giving it a $50 price difference between the two, and even though it has expired as of making this video, they actually extended it a few days. And so if you catch this video in the first couple days of launch, you should be able to use this code still. And after that, there'll be a $10 coupon, which I will also leave linked down below. But at the end of the day, I don't want to rely on those temporary coupon codes, so I am going to think of this as a $200 handheld before shipping. And so it is a $30 difference between this one and the Snapdragon 865 version, and so that's what I want to focus on in this video, is are we getting a value in that $30 in savings compared to the performance that we're losing? Now, I've already made a couple videos about the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, including an impressions video and then a full-on review, and so there are some things that I'm not going to go over in this video just because they're a little redundant. But I do want to give you a quick whirlwind tour of this device in case you've never seen it before, and number one, obviously, is that it's a clamshell. It's about the size of a Nintendo 3DS, but a little bit thicker, and also does not have 2 screens, it just has one. And even though it would be pretty cool to have a dual screen clamshell handheld, the fact that we have all this extra space down below does make for some pretty excellent control layout. So up top we have 2 analog sticks. These are Hall sensors and also have a good range of motion to them as well, and so I found these to be pretty darn comfortable. I think that they are well placed, and same thing with the D-pad and face buttons, which are also very easy to access. The D-pad has a dome switch clicky PS Vita style to it, and I really like this. It feels very accurate. And so when it comes to playing, things like precision platformers all the way through fighting games, I've really enjoyed this. It has a nice soft click every direction you go in. The face buttons are also very good. They are rubber membrane and have a light travel to them, and so I've also really enjoyed these. And then finally, rounding out the rest of the front, we have our select and start buttons, a back and home button for Android, and then our power and sleep button. And then of course down below we have 2 stereo speakers. On the top we have our shoulder and trigger buttons. These are analog input on the triggers, and I think they are pretty comfortable, but I've heard some people complaining that they wish they were a little bit more rounded along the edges right here to make them easier to press down on the edges. Personally, I think it's fine, but I can totally see that as well. Rounding out the rest, we have an active cooling fan that works well, and then we've got a little lanyard hole, our volume up and down, and then our micro SD card slot, as well as a USB-C port that is video out capable, as well as a headphone jack. And I think the main draw of this handheld is the clamshell form factor because, it will protect your screen and your controls when you close it up. And I love the fact that it goes to sleep when you close it. It wakes it back up when you open it up. And so it's a very seamless and console-like experience. And it's an Android-based device, which means setting it up is like any other Android-based handhelds. You're going to install your emulators, add your games, and then use a front end like Emulation Station to be able to actually access the games and give it a more console-like experience overall. I recently made an Android handheld starter guide which will apply to this device as well, and it takes a little bit of work to get an Android handheld set up, but once you have it set up, I think it's a wonderful experience. It just takes a little bit of work that first time around. Either way, in a quick nutshell, that's what this device is all about in terms of just overall functionality and size and everything else. If you want to know more about it, I would recommend checking out my Retroid Pocket Flip 2 review, which I will also leave linked down below. Now, one of the standout features of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is this screen. It is AMOLED and 5.5 inches with a 1080p resolution. So same size as the Nintendo Switch Lite screen, but I think a lot better. And it's the exact same screen as the previous Retroid Pocket Flip 2, as well as the Retroid Pocket 5. I have talked about this screen endlessly. I think it is wonderful. It's got really nice saturation and color balance and also very deep blacks and a wonderful contrast ratio. And so I think it's one of the better screens that I've ever used on a retro handheld. It also gets super bright to the point where I think you can easily play it outdoors, which cannot be said about a lot of other handhelds. This is also one of the biggest upgrades from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro to the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This one was 4.7 inches with a 750p resolution as opposed to 5.5 inches, which I think is kind of the perfect size for these smaller handhelds. And then of course AMOLED as well. And this might be one of the bigger deciding factors if you are choosing between a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 with the same chip, because this is a big upgrade from one to the other. And of course, the other big change between the two is the form factor. You have a horizontal candy bar style handheld versus something that is a clamshell and has a lot more functionality. The audio quality on this new Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is the same as the old one as well. I think it's pretty decent in terms of speakers, but a little bit more muffled than I would like. Let me give you a quick listen here. At the end of the day, I do think this is a bit of a weak point of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I wish there was more clarity, but I would not call these bad speakers by any means. So if anything, I would say they get the job done, but there is definitely room for improvement. Okay, so that was a quick down and dirty tour of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, and I want to move on to the more important stuff next, which is going to be the performance difference between the two, because I think that that's probably the major factor if you are looking to pick up a Retroid Pocket Flip 2 and you're not really sure which one to get, and maybe you want to save about $30. And so let's start with some benchmarks and then work our way through what you can expect with the Dimensity 1100 version, especially compared to the Snapdragon one. So for our benchmark, we're going to use 3D Mark Wildlife Stress Test. This is a 20-minute test that runs these 1-minute loops 20 times over. And so here are the results. On the left, we have the Dimensity 1100 that we're reviewing today, and on the right, we have the Snapdragon 865. So two major things to look at up top is, number one, the performance is slightly better on the Snapdragon, but not by much. It's almost within spitting distance, really. And the other thing to bear in mind is that these have ridiculous amounts of stability. They are both 99.5%. That's about the best that you can get. What this means is that even as you're playing something pretty heavy duty, it's still going to be nice and stable. You're not going to get thermal throttling. In fact, if we look at the bottom at the temperature, you can see that neither of these devices hovers over 30 degrees Celsius. That is super nice and cool. The other thing to look at is that the battery life is about the same between the two as well when pushed to max performance. So on the left, we have the Dimensity, and it lost 10% battery over that 20-minute period. On the Snapdragon side, it only lost 9%, so it's a little bit better, but still very close between the two. We're going to talk more about battery life near the end of the video, but for now, let's move on to emulation performance and a comparison of the two. And jumping into this, the first thing will be that it's a pretty foregone conclusion that, the lower end stuff is going to play great on this device. So things like Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, yeah, all this stuff is going to be excellent. Here I'm running everything with an LCD 3X grid shader just to kind of emphasize the whole handheld experience a little bit more. But yes, these games are running great. And the major factor in playing these games, much like with the other Retroid Pocket Flip 2 and even the Retroid Pocket 5 before it, is that the AMOLED display really makes these colors pop. So it's an enjoyable experience. Same thing when it comes to your 8-bit and 16-bit systems, all this stuff is going to play great. For the majority of these systems, I put on the CRT GOM shader because I think it looks really good. It has a nice little curvature to it, and it just has a nice CRT effect as well. And so this is what I used in my lightweight testing when it came to console systems as well as arcade. And again, the performance here is excellent, so no surprises here as well. Now moving on to 3D based systems, I did try to push things a little bit more just to see what we could get. So starting with PS1, I'm running this with DuckStation, and I did a combination of a 2x resolution upscale as well as a CRT shader within the DuckStation app, and I think it looks excellent, including a widescreen hack which just fills out the screen. So yeah, I think this is a really great way to play PS1. I did something similar with Nintendo 64. Here I stayed within RetroArch, but I gave it a 1080p upscale and then also implemented a widescreen hack. And I think this looks great with the majority of the games that you can play on this system. And of course, when it comes to performance, this thing is not even breaking a sweat. I'm just leaving it in the standard performance mode right here. Same thing when it came to Sega Dreamcast. I did a widescreen hack here as well, 1080p upscale within RetroArch, and yeah, everything is playing great. Now, some of the other systems are more demanding, so what I did here is I scrolled down from the top, went into the performance mode, and then changed it to the high performance setting. That is going to drain the battery faster, but that does give us better performance. And so that's what I did for the rest of the systems that you'll see throughout this video. And for Sega Saturn, this was the first time where I came up with a hit and miss scenario. So what I prefer to use is the Beetle core within RetroArch in Saturn. This generally will give you the highest accuracy when emulating this system, but it is more demanding. And I found that lightweight and medium weight games play just fine. When it came to harder to play games like Sega Rally Championship and Virtua Fighter 2, these ones were not quite at full speed. For example, with Sega Rally Championship, this one hovered around 58 frames per second. Not perfect, but still playable. However, there were definitely some distinct audio crackles when I was playing this, and so that may not be something that you're willing to live with. At that point, you can try out other cores like the Yabusan Shiro core and RetroArch or some of these standalone emulators, and that'll get you the rest of the way. It may not be as accurate as the Beetle core, but still definitely playable. So I would say that yes, you can play Sega Saturn on this device, but you may have to fiddle around with different emulators and different cores to get every game playable. Another system that ran really well is PlayStation Portable. I could play these at a 4x resolution upscale, which is 1080p, so it's going to match the resolution of the screen, and all of these games, including the harder run games like God of War, were playing absolutely fine. And so like with the Retroid Pocket 5 and the other Retroid Pocket Flip 2, this is one of my favorite ways to play PSP. Now moving on to the stuff that will really challenge this chipset, let's start with Nintendo GameCube. And having tested this chipset with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, I already knew that GameCube was pretty good on this, but I was surprised to find that basically everything I tried to play in Dolphin at a 2x resolution played absolutely fine with this device. And so I would say for the most part, it's relatively plug and play when it comes to playing GameCube and even Nintendo Wii. You may have to swap between, Vulkan and OpenGL backend, but that's really about it. For the most part, I found every game playable. However, there are degrees of playability and amount of performance that you can expect from these various chips. And so this will be the first time that we actually jump in and compare the two. And a good indicator of overall performance is going to be your max percentage. It's kind of like an overhead within Dolphin. So this will show you the absolute max speed that you could expect if you were to remove the actual 60 frames per second cap when playing a game. So in this example of Metroid Prime, we're getting about 180% full speed, and that means we have an 80% overhead over that 60 frames per second cap. And when comparing the exact same scene and settings between the two different chipsets, I got the exact same, about 180% average between the two, which says to me that yes, these chips are performing very similarly when it comes to Nintendo GameCube. And I found that to be true with just about every single game. They played at the same speed and had the same max percentage when I compared them back and back. However, there were some subtle differences, including emulation accuracy. If you look at the track in F-Zero GX, on the left side you can see that it doesn't seem to be lit properly. The track looks a lot darker on the left side, which I think is probably just a GPU optimization or implementation of these shaders. And so I would say on the right side, it's a more accurate representation of what it was supposed to be when playing this game on original hardware. And so even though with Dolphin the performance seems to be the same between the two, accuracy might be different. And I found that the Snapdragon 865 version does tend to get a little bit better in terms of accuracy between the two. So long story short, I think the Dimensity 1100 version of the Flip 2 is very good when it comes to GameCube and Wii, but not quite as accurate as the Snapdragon 865 out of the box. Now moving over to PlayStation 2 is where we will see a more clear contrast between the Dimensity 1100 and Snapdragon 865. And let me start by saying that the Dimensity 1100 is still pretty darn decent when it comes to playing PlayStation 2 titles. For the most part, you will be able to play most PlayStation 2 games on this chipset, either at a native resolution, but many times at a 2x resolution upscale. There will certainly be some problematic games that may require you to go in and change out some settings, or potentially use things like the PAL version of the ROM to get it to run at a 50 frames per second max, but overall I would still say that you're going to have a pretty good time playing PS2 titles on this device. But I do want to spend some time focusing on the pain points of playing PlayStation 2 titles on this compared to the Snapdragon 865, so you can see the difference between the two when it comes to overall performance. Let's start with Dragon Quest VIII. This is a game that I would consider to be playable on this device. I'm using NeitherSX2, the latest version of the classic emulator here, at a 2x resolution upscale with the Vulkan backend. And for the most part, I was able to play this game with no problems. A couple slowdowns here and there, but still absolutely playable. But like with the GameCube, there are different degrees of playability. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to turn on fast forward to remove the frame limit and see just how fast these games can go. And we've got a pretty good buffer on the Dimensity 1100 version on the left. This one can play at about 130% when putting it on fast forward. However, the Snapdragon 865 gives me a much bigger buffer. It's about 230 to 250% when I'm actually running it in fast forward. So about 100% better between the two. So what this says to me is that you can expect some slowdowns and maybe a couple hiccups with the Dimensity 1100 version depending on the scene that you're playing in the game, whereas the Snapdragon 865 has plenty of performance overhead to be able to play this game much more smoothly. Another good example is Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition, so about 150% max on the Dimensity 1100, but about 250% max on the Snapdragon 865. So again, about a 100% difference between the two, which means that yes, they are both playable, but the Snapdragon 865 is going to have an easier time playing this game. Now for other examples, it's going to be the difference between unplayable and playable, and I think Jack 3 is a good example here. The device on the left can only play at about 50 or 60% full speed, which means I would consider this to be completely unplayable. Meanwhile, on the right, we're getting somewhere between like 120 and 150%. There are still going to be some slowdowns here and there with the Snapdragon 865, but I at least would consider this section of Jack 3 to be absolutely playable. And unfortunately, no matter what settings I tried to tweak, and even dropping it down to a native resolution here, I couldn't really get a good gameplay experience out of Jack 3. And so this is what I'm talking about here, where some games may not be playable on the Dimensity 1100 version when they are on the other version of the Flip 2. I had a similar experience with God of War 2. I'm playing both of these at a 2x resolution Vulkan backend, and you can see that the Dimensity 1100 one is just struggling to keep up, to the point where I would not consider it to be playable with these settings. On the other hand, the Snapdragon 865 is playing just fine without having to do any sort of configuration tweaks. Now, I'm not saying that God of War 2 is not playable on the Dimensity 1100. You could use the PAL version of the ROM. You could also do things like, underclocking to be able to improve the experience, but I would still prefer to play it on the Snapdragon 865 because then I don't have to dive deep into the settings just to get it workable. And so this is one of those clear examples where the Snapdragon 865 definitely gives you an advantage over playing it with the Dimensity version. So putting it all together, I would say that neither of these devices are perfect for PlayStation 2. Something like Sly Cooper 3 still doesn't play super well on the Snapdragon 865 at a 2x resolution. But when you have to compare one to the other, then there are definitely going to be moments where the Snapdragon 865 outperforms the Dimensity 1100. My last example here would be Burnout Revenge. This is a game that plays just fine at a 2x resolution on the Snapdragon version, but here with the Dimensity 1100 Flip 2, it can't even run at a native resolution at full speed. Let's go over a couple other examples. Let's do Nintendo Wii U first with the CEMU emulator. So this one I'm running at the same settings, which is a 720p resolution and low shadows with Wind Waker HD. I'm also not using any special drivers, just the ones that are built into the device itself, but this is a night and day difference between the two. The only way I could even get the Dimensity 1100 one to actually boot was to disable the HUD within the graphics pack settings, which means that you can't see things like the number of hearts that Link's has, but at least you can play the game. Meanwhile, on the Snapdragon 865, I didn't have to do any workarounds to actually jump into the game, and it's running at full speed. On the other hand, the Dimensity 1100 one is only running at about 60% speeds, and so this is a clear difference between the two, where I would consider the one on the right to be playable and the one on the left to not be. So when it comes to this game, you're probably better off just playing the GameCube version on the Dimensity version, but with the Snapdragon one, you actually have the choice between the Wii U version or the GameCube one as well. Now, there's going to be a big difference when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, and it doesn't really have to do with performance power, but rather the GPU drivers. The thing about Snapdragon chips in particular is that it allows you to use custom-made GPU drivers. And so for the example here with Citron, I'm using Mesa Turnip drivers right here, which really improves compatibility and performance when it comes to Nintendo Switch, and it can also be used on other systems like PlayStation Vita as well as Nintendo Wii U. And so let's do a quick comparison between the two with the custom drivers available on Snapdragon devices versus the Mali drivers that we have on the Dimensity 1100. A good example here is going to be Hades, one of the harder to run games on Nintendo Switch that is still playable on the Snapdragon 865. On the right side, it is running at full speed, so a nice solid 60 frames per second. A couple dips here and there in the heat of combat, but I would still consider it to be very playable. Meanwhile, the Flip 2 on the left can only run at about 40 frames per second and is a very stuttery experience. And so, yeah, I would not want to play it on the one on the left, but on the right, absolutely playable. Other games have a hard time booting up in the first place. Ori and the Blind Forest is a great example. This one can sometimes get to the loading screen, but more often than not, when you try to start up the game, it just goes into a black screen with this emulator. Meanwhile, with my custom drivers on the Snapdragon 865, I have no problem jumping into the game and playing it at full speed in handheld mode. And so again, this is the difference between something that's playable and something that is not. Same thing with Risk of Rain 2, I'm able to boot up into at least the loading screen on the left, but once it actually gets into game, it crashes out and goes back to the main menu. Meanwhile, on the Snapdragon 865, I've got no problem booting into the game and playing it at full speed. So again, when it comes to Nintendo Switch in particular, there's a very stark contrast between the two. So putting it all together, I would say that everything up to like PSP and GameCube and Nintendo Wii are very excellent on the Dimensity 1100. You might get a couple compatibility issues here and there, but for the most part, all those systems will run fine. But if you are trying to focus on things like PlayStation 2, Nintendo Wii, and even lightweight Nintendo Switch, then the Snapdragon 865 processor in the more expensive Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is going to be a better bet. So it is going to come down to what you expect to play. If it's just going to be the classic systems, then you might be able to save yourself $30 and enjoy them on the cheaper Retroid Pocket Flip 2. Another big difference between the Dimensity and Snapdragon versions of this device is that the Snapdragon one can actually boot into Linux. So this right here is called ROCKNIX, which is a Linux-based operating system that is focused on emulation as well as running ports. And ROCKNIX can play some emulators that are not available on Android, including native Pico 8 as well as the Xbox emulator, which is pretty crazy. Now, for many systems, performance is not quite up to par with Android, but it is pretty close, and it's a much simpler experience in terms of overall setup. And so I like the fact that you can choose between Android and Linux with the Snapdragon version, which is something you cannot do with the Dimensity version. And being able to play PC ports via a tool called Portmaster is also very awesome. They've got over 1,000 ports that you can play. I made a whole Portmaster video some time back. I will leave it linked down in the description below, but I think this might be part of your buying decision as well. Now, in addition to playing emulated systems on these devices, they are Android-based, which means that you can also play Android games on them. And when it comes to playing Android games, I didn't find really any difference between the Snapdragon and Dimensity versions of this chip. So if you are looking to play most moderate to even heavyweight Android games, it should be just fine on either one of these Flip 2 devices. However, one thing I did find interesting is that the streaming experience was a little bit worse on the Dimensity version compared to the Snapdragon one. So here I'm doing local local streaming with my PC in the studio just directly over to the device using apps called Apollo and Artemis. And on the Dimensity version, it wasn't half bad. I was able to connect no problem here, and the experience was pretty good, but I did see that the decoding time was quite a bit higher. On average, I got somewhere between 8 and 10 milliseconds, but on the Snapdragon version, I got somewhere between 2 and 4. So really what we're looking at here is a decoding time that was about half that on the Snapdragon compared to the Dimensity one. So if you are planning on using the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 for game streaming, either over the cloud or locally, it does seem to be that the Snapdragon is a little bit more performant. One other thing I wanted to test is whether or not we could use video out with this device, and sure enough, yes, we can. I was able to connect it with just about anything, including the Retroid Pocket official dock. And it's really the same experience between the Snapdragon and Dimensity versions as well. You can even play it with the lid shut, and this will give you a nice console-like experience. So you can hook it up to a Bluetooth controller and then play your games on a bigger screen TV. You could either just use an HDMI to USB-C adapter, but I personally like using a dock like the official one from Retroid, which is only about $30. But the nice thing about this is that you can also charge the device at the same time. And finally, before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about battery life. So I found this to be pretty darn good. I first tested it on the low end side, so playing things like, Game Boy Advance and Super Nintendo, even with like CRT and grid filter shaders, I got between 14 and 16 hours of battery life. So that is very impressive. It's kind of all day gaming at that point. I also tested it at the mid-range, so this was playing games on GameCube as well as PS2, and a variety of different games here, so not necessarily the hardest to play games and not the easiest ones, but somewhere in between. And the average battery life that I got here was between 6 and 8 hours. Again, I think that's very impressive for playing Gen 6 systems. And then finally, at the highest end, this is playing things like Nintendo Switch emulation, or even just running the benchmark stress test, and I got 3 hours and 20 minutes in the worst case scenario. And so overall, I would say the Dimensity 1100 has some excellent battery life on the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. Anywhere from, 3 hours at the lowest point, but upwards of 16 hours when playing lightweight stuff. Okay, so now that we have a good idea of what to expect in terms of performance and compatibility with the Dimensity version of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, let's actually discuss whether or not I think it's worth it in the first place compared to the other options we have today. And I think, again, it really comes down to this layout right here, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro versus the Flip 2 with the same chip versus the Flip 2 with the better chip. And if we're only comparing the two Retroid Pocket Flip 2 devices, $200 versus $230, I think in most cases, the Flip 2 with the Snapdragon chip is going to be your better investment. The additional performance and optimizations with Snapdragon and also the ability to use custom drivers plus the ability to dual boot into Linux, I think is well worth $30. And so in the context of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, I don't think it's worth saving $30 to lose all the additional compatibility and other features that you get with the Snapdragon version. However, if none of that stuff applies to you and you only plan on playing this with retro systems and PSP and maybe some GameCube, then I could see the Dimensity 1100 one being worth it if you want to save those $30 and your budget is very tight. Even then, I still think it might be worth saving that additional $30 up and getting the Snapdragon version just to make this one a little bit more future-proof in case you want to do things like run PC ports on Linux, or maybe you want to dabble in things like PS2 and lightweight Nintendo Switch. So when it comes down to it, I think in like 95% of use cases, if you are thinking about getting a Retroid Pocket Flip 2, then the Snapdragon one is the one that I would recommend. If you're already going to be spending $200 on a handheld, then an additional $30 to get a lot more functionality just makes a lot more sense to me. Now, in the context of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and whether or not it's worth the upgrade from one to the other, this is a little bit different of a story. Right now, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is going for $150, but many of the color options are not available. They've been slowly selling out. But as it stands right now on the website, they're selling this for $150, whereas this one is $200. So it's a $50 upgrade from one to the other. And I think between the two, the clear winner is the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 in terms of the clamshell form factor, but then also this screen. This is a much better screen compared to the other. But even then, I don't think that the upgrade from one to the other is worth a full $50. That seems a little bit high for me. Instead, I think that the introductory price that they were first offering, which is $180 for the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 with the Dimensity 1100, makes a lot more sense. That makes it $50 cheaper than the Snapdragon version, which I think is a pretty good spread between the two, and then only $30 more expensive than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. And so I think the balance makes more sense if this was sold for $180. That means it would be a $30 difference between the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which I think is a sizable upgrade, getting the better screen and also the clamshell form factor. But then also, a $50 difference between the two does make this a more stark contrast and is a more appropriate difference between the two. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to price to performance. And I think that for $200 retail, this is priced a little bit too high compared to Retroid's own catalog. At that point, I would recommend spending an additional $30 to get the Snapdragon version of the Flip 2, or saving $50 by getting the $150 version of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. So in the end, I'm a little bit torn about the Dimensity 1100 version of this device. I mean, the Snapdragon version of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 so far is my favorite handheld of the year, but this one just quite isn't hitting the mark at this price point. It all really comes down to price, and at $180, I think this would make a lot more sense, but if they're going to keep it at $200, then I do think it's worth it to just get the regular Snapdragon one instead. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the Dimensity version of the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I think it's a fine little device, but the fact that we have a Snapdragon one for only $30 more means that I'm going to pick this one every single time. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.